So that whole of life cycle piece, and that longevity of how do we actually get that, the change of focus perhaps? And I think there's been that traditional sort of focus in the CapEx. So how do we get that change of focus? And given our experience most recently, is how do we get the people who are paying for it to think about not just the initial costs but the ongoing costs, and not just in terms of the money but in terms of the impact on our environment and our society and indeed our economy over the years to come?
It's difficult because we have such a diverse group of client owners or owners of particular infrastructural buildings. So those that take the view that we hold this for the duration of its life, such as roads, rail, and some institutional investors will look at the whole of life. Some other clients will look at, say, an apartment building where they naturally hand over the ownership of that to a group of owners, and so that you've got the sort of the bookend and of owner types. And I don't think from a sustainability point of view there's a way of measuring that whole of life. I think if you can somehow, unfortunately, if you can measure that whole of life and then somehow, I suppose force is not the word I'd like to use, but I can't think of one, but force the owners to perhaps consider it as a way of demonstrating more sustainable design.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting point you're making, that if you're going to own the asset going forward, there's more of a reason, I suppose, for you to think about that whole of life cycle. And maybe that's a point to sort of throw back to you, Kathleen, is that in terms of the Design and Building Practitioners Act in New South Wales, it's become very narrow focused again and back to Class 2 residentials effectively. And as we know in that space, most of those, it's a developer, and as Tony was just saying, it's not the developer that's going to own that asset. It's passed on. So how do we influence the conversation to get the developers on side with all of the professionals and the institutions to ensure that we get a better terms and longevity and quality in our Class 2 residential?
Well, I think Class 2 with the new Act, that will happen. And it's not just Class 2, so it's any mixed use within a Class 2. So if it is a apartment building and there's, retail and a childcare centre and a office building, that's all actually included. So I think there will actually be a sort of, automatic roll-off to the other classes anyway. So because the Act basically says we now, as designers, have to fully document anything that relates to the 5 areas within the BCA, that's much better than what it used to be, or that it is at the moment with a typical D&C just in time, go out to tender when you're only at 30 or 40% documents and then let them dribble out if you actually even get to be involved on site. So that makes a huge difference. But I think if it's not Class 2, I would really like to see post-occupancy evaluation be a standard process that happens in all projects, especially for those that are developers that are end owners as well, because then we start getting feedback about products and whether they're good. And that can actually go back to Australian manufacturers so that you can understand, these lights actually may look great, but actually they're rubbish long term. So I think it's a combination of both. It's, the DBP Act for Class 2, I think will most definitely, because it's legislated, make a difference so that there's a better quality documentation to start off with. So because the builders then have to sign off and declare that they've built to what's designed, that will make a big difference. And then for all the other classes, if we can all be aware of how our products all are actually used, makes a difference. And one other thing, sorry if I can just add in, is do we have to decide that we have to knock down buildings? Can we reuse as much as we possibly can in the first place? So maybe, can you adapt what you have, or can you add on to it? Because for us to think knock everything down and start again is just the complete wrong approach.
That's good. Well, I saw James nodding at that point there. So, James.
I think just to that last point, I've been intrigued walking around Sydney in recent months, seeing a number of developments taking exactly that approach. A big one up in Bathurst Street. It's been going for a couple of years now where it's good to see that it's not a complete tear down, rebuild. So I think there are green shoots on that front.
And apart from the aesthetics, there's a lot of embedded energy in those buildings that we're tearing down. So that's a big step in its own right. Don't tear it down unless we have to rework the asset. Okay, so if we're looking into this whole space, we mentioned standards and quality, linked into, that they're essentially linked. What is the quality level that we're looking for? I'm going to say, because quality means different things to different people. If I asked you as an architect, that might mean a different thing to James or Tony or Matt as an engineer, or a lay person in the street. What do we actually mean by that word quality? Is it about the environment that we're creating for the people? Is it bringing it into a human perspective? Or is it just saying that we've met standards and codes, so it's been built to the standards and codes? That's great, tick the box. So I'll maybe come back to you,
so
Catherine.
I think you're right. So how I define quality is different how everybody else defines quality. But I think at the end of the day, it's down to the consumer. It needs to be able to feel safe and that what they have is reliable. So I think the building commissioner came up with a good word, and that's what he calls trustworthiness. So can you trust that this building that you move into is going to be safe, reliable, it's going to be there. It's just like when you buy a toaster, it's going to work, and it's going to work for 2 years, at least. If you use a bathroom, it's going to be appropriate. It's going to be waterproofed, and the apartment underneath won't leak. So I think using the word trustworthiness is something, because, if you're a developer and you're going to own a product, you're really aware of what you're getting. But if you're an individual that's buying into an apartment, you probably don't know what you're looking for. You're just looking at, the quality is what it looks like on the outside, whether it's shiny or not. And that's not enough. It's got to be something that's got depth, that will last, that you can rely on. So the trustworthiness is how I'd sort of go.
What do you think to that? Trustworthiness, a good phrase, Matt?
Definitely agree. I think the other interesting space there with residentials, like we're talking about, it might be the bookend of owning an asset and not flipping it but selling it on. Then you've got the rise of the build to rent space potentially in Sydney, and no longer might you have a developer that they've sold everything. Well, they might have sold everything before they've actually started building it, but now you've got a developer that might be owning this asset for the next 20, 30 years.
Can I interrupt? Because that's what I'm worried about. So the whole build to rent issue is a problem I have, because at the moment the legislation's only saying 15 years. So what we don't want is developers that build for something that's going to last 15 years. It's got to be longer than that.
I'd agree with you. And I think that comes back to the initial discussion of where do we see the industry for our children's generation? That should be the timeline that we're aiming for assets. But I think, I would like to think at least, that it is a positive step in terms of 15 years isn't enough, but it's more than the 2 years or the 7 years that they have at the moment. So hopefully that starts moving the design direction in the right way.
15 years, Matt, that does not seem like a long time. Tony, if we're thinking about 15 years and longer, how do we design and build for the long term, so that we don't have issues around the embedded energy, and so that we can look at how we repurpose our assets going forward?
To do that effectively, you really need to have that as part of your design criteria starting the project. You really need to have around material selection and constructability, always thinking that it'll have to be repurposed, or it will be repurposed at some time in the future. So looking at the way you construct it, the way you fit out, the way you put all the particular elements on the main structure, which has a much longer design life than that, but certainly making sure that you can facilitate the easy repurposing of a building. I think it needs to be up front in the design process.
Excellent, thank you, Tony. So, Kathleen, if I come back to you, and one of the things around when we're working from home, a lot more of us, our own personal environment and our own personal office space has changed, and we have a lot of asset owners that have tower blocks in Sydney CBD, and a whole range of different assets. How do we ensure that when we're building for the longer term, that we have some flexibility in there to repurpose? What role does an architect have to play in that environment that we're creating for ourselves?
Well, I think architects always like a challenge, Greg. So even if a building has been designed as an office building, there are examples here in Sydney. There's one just down the end of the road actually that's then been converted to an apartment building. So I don't think you can't. Sometimes it's really interesting. I've seen some really wonderful wheat silos that have been converted into living environment. So I don't think that's the actual issue. The issue is more making sure that we try to keep buildings and we don't knock them down.
I think that's a really important point just now, because obviously COVID brought a huge amount of change to a lot of people very quickly. And some asset owners might think they've got redundant assets or stranded assets. So how would we encourage them to look at that repurposing? I mean, you like a challenge, they might not. They might say, let's tear it down and rebuild. How would
just cost far too much to pull something down. So I think one thing that we have all learnt during COVID is, we all went down to the wire really, most businesses. We, certainly in my business and most architects took pay cuts, to try to make sure that we could keep everyone employed. And I think a lot of businesses did that as well. So in terms of what your resources are, to use what you have and to not pull it down is the most appropriate. But I'd also say, I know your concern is that in the city there's lots of empty office buildings. I actually think people are starting to go back to work now.
Right, okay, that's good. Now in terms of maybe a little technical piece in terms of the building reform that's happening, the legislation here in New South Wales, it's really focused on Class 2, and you did mention before that it's mixed use and it's beyond that. Are there any implications in terms of the way the Act applies? If we repurpose buildings and make them residential, they become Class 2, or even vice versa? Yeah,
so if you repurpose a building and it becomes a Class 2, the Act would still apply. So it's any building that is a Class 2. And I think that would be really interesting. But the reality is you still have to deal with the BCA and the Australian standards anyway. So it's just a matter of making sure that it's still fully designed and documented.
Okay, good. So moving away, I suppose, James, from the particulars of the Design and Building Practitioners Act, Laing O'Rourke are involved in some huge infrastructure projects all around the world. So what's the line, I suppose, and how does Laing O'Rourke tackle longevity in terms of that design and then the operation and the handover of an asset like the Ichthus project in Darwin? There you go, one off the top of my head that I was involved with.
Well, I mean, there were some particulars around that. Pretty hard to turn something like that one in Darwin you mentioned into something different. But more broadly, we as professionals, either design or construct, sometimes both, assets that have a really long life. I think the creativity or the elegance of engineers and constructors is making sure they have that flexibility to respond to not only the needs of today, but to some extent future casting for the needs of tomorrow. We have examples around this city of buildings that were built 100 plus years ago that still function really well today. They might have had a reinvention or multiple reinventions over that lifetime. But I think it's incumbent on engineers, architects, constructors to really think creatively around how you embed that flexibility, adaptability into the things that we will leave as a generation, so that it's, hospitals are a great example. There's a hospital down the road here in Camperdown that is over 100 years old. It was built to respond to epidemiology profiles that are entirely different from the world we live in today. The one thing we know, if we go and build a new hospital, Northern Beaches Hospital might be an example, it's built today to respond to the needs of today, but in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years time, the need will be different. That's a real challenge for technically minded folks to, gaze into the crystal ball and try and anticipate what those needs will be. So great engineering, great architecture, great design should create that flexibility. And that's certainly a challenge for us in the things that we're building now around the business I'm part of.
Okay, you used the phrase future casting there. What's the role of technology in that? How does a business like Laing or Aurecon adopt and implement technology to help you with that future casting?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball in a filing cabinet in the office. I'm still looking for it. But there is a really important role that technology can play in, I suppose, in many dimensions of the conversation we're having tonight. Talk about quality. Last year, I think, Tony, in your introduction, you mentioned, we responded in a pretty agile way through 2020. It was an imperative. We couldn't keep doing business as normal or business as usual. We were faced with a challenge and we had to adapt and respond. One of the very real challenges we faced, and we were pretty fortunate when you look around all the sectors of our economy, construction was largely unimpacted. But we couldn't have all the people on site that we would otherwise typically have. We couldn't have all the people in our offices that we would otherwise typically have. So we had to look at tools and technology that allowed people to continue doing their job from the kitchen bench. That was our new normal. But out of that really acute challenge last year, some of that application of technology to deal with those issues of last year have relevance going forward. Talk about quality. How do we get real certainty, confidence, the building of the trust? There's a role for technology in what I call progressive assurance. So as we go through a complex build, we can record everything about that build. Is it in the right place? Is it of the right specification? Has it been installed correctly? That's all really important evidence capture. So we're working on that frontier so that we can build trust with the end users, the owners of the things that we leave behind. As an industry, we need to be really exploring where technology can add value and build the trust that is needed in corners of the industry.
Okay, thank you, James. And turning to you again, Tony, I suppose we come back into it, using technology, trust. I suppose it's that capability to do things in a really difficult situation. Maybe I know this is an area that you're really keen on. So where does that fit into that ability of Aurecon to deliver when you've got that from concept right the way through to delivery and beyond?
In terms of, I just would add one thing before I start. The other day, in terms of technology, and I was amazed the other day on a particular site. One of the products we'd specified, which was a Hilti bolt, which is had an actual QR code on the end of the bolt, and if you use a certain app, you can flick that, and it'll tell you absolutely everything you need to know about that particular bolt and where it was manufactured and the specifications around it. So I think that's one thing about technology is one thing I've sort of appreciated over the years is the speed at which it develops, and it's just exponential. So I'm encouraged to think that in the future, not long, we'll be able to take all that data from material selection, looking at how that the actual life of that particular element, the supply chain, the whole life of that particular element will be recorded in real time, and something I'm sort of quite interested in.
I think that's a really interesting point. Before we come back to that question, so Matt, that in terms of the work that you have, I think you were saying that's part of the challenge, isn't it? Is knowing how the products that you're using are, where they're from, how they're made, in that space. So the technology, where do you see the opportunities are in that line with the facade engineering?
I think exactly there. So say a general facade might have 6 or 7 different materials that go into it. Each of those materials might need 3 or 4 different steps to get it to that final product. From a quality perspective, it's more than important that each of those steps are done. So there's a checking point that technology could help to register when that was done and how it was done. And then also from a traceability perspective, it would be amazing to be able to know this product came from this region, it's travelled from here, it started off here. And I think if you were able to see that, and you're able to see that through a QR code, a report, I think there's something very powerful about being able to look it up yourself. Mm-hmm. I think you'd then have more interest in that, and people would then be, people would make decisions based on that, mm-hmm. I'd like to think. So I think there's a huge potential there.
Yeah, and as Tony was saying there about that healthy product, knowing not only where it was made and its provenance, I suppose, but what its capabilities are, because you can look it up. Yeah. That makes a big difference. So back to that I suppose that question about technology and how that enabled Aurecon in that space to continue to deliver the services that you did to your clients, Tony. There's opportunities in there, there's some challenges, and that I suppose one of those phrases is that the remote office and the remote project site are very different kind of places to the actual project site.
No, definitely. I mean, last year we have various project teams on various remote offices. So we have been operating for quite a few years with different project teams, sometimes relocated to a particular project office, and we're quite used to working remotely and working within a team environment. So for us last year, it wasn't a huge step change, but what I've noticed in the last 12 months of operating, finding a lot more speed in terms of being able to deliver. Well, certainly some of the solutions to clients. So, when you're in a discussion within a team, an environment, whatever virtual meeting you have, you can very quickly get the key people to join at a very short notice and resolve issues very quickly. And that's something we've certainly, the industry as a whole has developed that skill, not relying on as many face-to-face meetings, not relying on the time wasted in terms of getting to those meetings, and you're just able to focus a lot more in terms of the speed of being able to deliver that service. And
Aurecon, like many engineering businesses and architectural businesses, a lot of professional services, obviously you have people who are based around the country in different offices. They're now based at home, based overseas, they're in a multitude of locations. Apart from the practicalities of the technology and the advantage of being able to get everyone in the virtual room quickly, does that pose any, I suppose, regulatory or accountability challenges? Because we live in the reality of a federated country. Does that make any difference if it's an engineer doing work in Brisbane, or an engineer doing work in Perth, or an engineer doing work in Sydney or Victoria?
Not necessarily. I mean, we have teams working. We have engineers. We always take the view it's the best person for that particular project. So that's how we adopt our sort of team selection. Mm-hmm. So wherever that engineer is, wherever he or she may be, that person is then allocated to that project. So we've, as I said, for a long time we've operated in that virtual environment. We're quite used to that.
And it's a truly global profession, isn't it?
Exactly.
So and maybe keeping on to that space and coming back to you, James, in terms of that accountability and regulatory perspective, that advancement of technology, does that pose any problems for Laing O'Rourke and what you do, or is it It's all roses in the garden.
It's a challenge, with the best will in the world. We still find it challenging to bring technology to bear and get everybody as enthused about the possibilities of that. Change is sometimes slower than we might want. If I just think around the sort of public sector portfolio, there are some still very staid and traditional practices, things like wet signatures on signal diagrams. I was talking to a colleague recently around a big complex project we have here in Sydney, where we have to do a physical mock-up of a big piece of equipment and demonstrate how we would move that equipment through a tight space. Technology can absolutely unlock some productivity gain and probably give us greater confidence and certainty. We could do that in a virtual environment and probably achieve the same assurance around the sign-off of that. So, technology, adoption of technology and the pace of adoption of technology, it operates on a varying scale, and it depends on who you're engaging with. We're very enthusiastic for heading in that direction. Others need a little more coaching to go on the journey. But again, going back to the role of engineers and architects, it's not something we should shy away from. It's something we should, embrace as part of our role in society. And the regulators have a very important role to fill. But our challenge is giving them the confidence that we are still doing the really diligent engineering. We're not compromising on quality. We're simply taking a different approach, borrowing from technology that we now have at our fingertips.
And so if I could just add, James, it's certainly not really consistent across the industry. Some of our supply chain is not quite there, so that's the other challenge. Is you have to have everyone in the supply chain at the same level of
but
expertise.
I think the other thing is that the universities and the students are driving this. So we're now finding that we've got students coming out of architecture schools that put on the full-on gear, and they've designed all these spaces and they walk their clients through it. So the big architectural practices are doing that, but they're actually learning as well. So NSW has this facility where they can actually go and learn trades, etc., by wearing these glasses. So you don't have to actually physically be there, but they can get lots of people through, shown how to do it really quickly and effectively and efficiently. And so we can potentially do all of that. But all of this conversation, I keep thinking in my head, basically what you're saying is we all need to be BIM. So that basically we'll get to the point where we are specifying and putting in all of these items, so that when you get to on site, for the site guys to actually put in their Hilti bolt, they're scanning this one and recognising that it's this particular one. So whoever the building manager is later on, they know absolutely everything. And I get back to my point about post-occupancy evaluation. Then we'll actually be able to have real data of how things are being able to use.
And I know you're passionate about this, but I saw you wanting to say something this side, I think, as well, Matt, in terms of the technology in that space. Is it all good? Is it all? And I use that phrase, and that a lot of people can be quite wary of new technology because they're not sure if it will be compliant or it will fit with the code, or how is it good, and how do we win the argument that technology can do these things that Kathleen was saying, is that you can have, here's the bolt, this is the one I used, this is how I installed it, this is it.
I think so going back to the engineering sense, technology is great that it can speed up the technical side of the work we do, but I think you still need to be able to demonstrate the fundamentals or the statics of what you do separately to, I guess, and that's to provide everyone the foundation of, acceptance of what you're doing, possibly quicker or possibly easier, but you need to be able to give people the confidence that it's right. And if someone's used to it being done a different way, if you can demonstrate that you're still meeting what they've done before, they're then much more receptive to follow, I guess, to join your journey in the new technology.
And I quite often find that the people who are using that technology are comfortable with it, but quite often the regulators aren't. So when we're in that, we've got that lag. How do we convince the regulators that this is the way forward and this is what we should be doing? We should be all BIMmed. You know, what's the argument that convinces them that this is the right thing?
I think it is doing, probably at the moment, it's doing 2 steps. So it's doing it possibly their way, and the, I guess, use of technology, at least for a period of time where you can say, look, this is what we're doing. I think the regulation will catch up, because I think they're also getting an influx of new people that will be more familiar with, I haven't done it, but the VR, that's maybe not quite, we couldn't quite do that with engineering, or I can't think of it, but eventually those steps will catch up. And I think the more familiar people are with it, the easier it is to convey what you're trying to get across.
Right, good. Maybe taking the conversation in a slightly different direction, before we go to some very specific questions that have come in from the audience. We started off about talking about our environment and sustainability, and I suppose what will our children inherit. So everything we do in the building and construction involves people and place. So one of the questions, I suppose, to start off with is people. We often hear that we haven't got enough people with the right skills, you know, with that capacity and capability and competence area. And with our borders closed as a country, our reliance upon importing engineers and professionals is perhaps not a model that's sustainable. Who knows where we're going to go with that one. So when we look at that, what are we looking forward to in terms of the future? How do we grow our own? How do we get more of our young people involved in the architecture or engineering? Or how do we help people from other industries transition across? And the big nod of the head there, James, means that I'm coming straight to you first.
Thanks, Greg. There's no doubt the task ahead is enormous, and as I said earlier, you know, tackling it the same way isn't the answer. I think there's a real responsibility on the engineering and infrastructure and construction sector broadly to really explore ways where we can invite greater participation. You know, we were fortunate we weren't as impacted as other parts of our economy through last year. I think the flip side that comes with that is perhaps there's a responsibility on us to create the roles and the platform for some of those parts of our economy that were more affected, more disrupted, to come and contribute in the construction and infrastructure sectors. And that requires the sort of challenging of normal ways of working. We talked about, you know, the connected data that could sit in the digital geometries of the physical things that we ultimately deliver. You know, data analytics as a skill set within engineering and construction, that is going to be a new normal in the years ahead. Digital skills, gaming, technology, you know, the skills that come out of the sort of entertainment sector, not that they're, you know, having a particular downturn. I'm talking to a friend the other day that, you know, the movie industry in Australia is doing well, but, you know, there are skills out there that are not a million miles away from what we need in the construction sector. That all lends itself to unlocking productivity gains as an industry. Again, we're in the bottom of the league table in terms of productivity. We need to reinvent ways of working to unlock skills. One of those, I think, is trying to shift more of our somewhat hazardous, unsafe, low quality activities that might typically happen on a construction site, if we flip those into activities that can happen in a manufacturing environment, where we've got greater control over quality, safety, we can have greater participation from sectors of our society that might not otherwise participate. That is a journey we need to go on. And that requires a bit of work in the codes and standards and with clients that recognise that there might be investment required to activate manufacturing, rather than transacting on each and every project on a one-off basis. You know, it's never enough to unlock the investment required to stimulate manufacturing
I'm glad I came to you first on that one. But Tony, this is something I know that you talk about quite often as well, and sometimes there's that question in there about, you know, why is it a construction or an infrastructure led? Why is government going to go down this route? And something that you've said before is there's so many different jobs, for want of a better phrase, that lead up to that hole being dug in the ground and everything that goes on during and after. So maybe if you could pick up on some of the points that James was saying there.
Yeah, certainly. When you look at the amount of work that goes into a project being at the point that you're starting to dig the first hole in the ground, or the first hole for a foundation. From a planning point of view, from a design point of view, procurement, I mean, there's an enormous number of people involved in these projects, and I think if I look at it from a technology point of view, I think as an industry, and sort of also looking at the discussion around the skill set that's out there, as an industry, traditionally engineering, well, certainly when I went through university, we were applied mathematicians, and we needed great skills in mathematics and design and physics. Now there's a sort of a step change in terms of the software and the analysis tools and the skill set that's coming out between design, engineering design and architectural design. It's almost sort of merging, and I see a point not too far in the future there, where a lot of the skills that we needed when we first, my generation of engineers, it's not really required. So then thinking, well, what can we do in terms of bringing other people in with similar skill sets, perhaps not engineering, and how they can contribute to the design. And I think we need to think a bit differently. We've always thought traditionally, you know, the engineering degree and the skill sets that are there, and how we need to change that going forward, and to make it a bit broader, and to take away some of those tedious tasks that as engineers we all have, which are really critical because they're the things that stop the buildings falling over in the wind. But if we can assure those designs and have you know, and have more of a focus on a closer relationship between design and architecture, and relieve some of those, as I said, those tedious tasks, I think we can then bring other people from the industry in to participate, because I think we have a real challenge. We have the numbers that you spoke about, you know, the requirement to supplement the number of engineers going forward. Then I'm finding with the engineers, the graduates that we have, the recent graduates, they tend to look a little bit more short-term than traditionally we have. So after 5-10 years in the industry, they think, well, what's next? And I'll go down a completely different path. So we've got that challenge at both ends. So that's, I can sort of see we have to think differently to secure our future supply. So I don't know if I answered your question directly, but I reminded a bit.
It's I mean, this is a conversation I have frequently with people, so it's good to hear all the views on it. In terms of yourself, Matt, back to that bit, the people in place piece, we're looking at the people. We have a procurement supply chain break, and that we've got closed borders. We can't bring people in as easily. Opportunities in there for growing our own, for want of a better phrase.
Yeah, I think definitely. I think while we can't bring people in, we're also finding it, or we can't send people overseas to check I guess, critical tasks that normally people would go check. So I think there's a degree of trust at the moment that things are going well, but I think that's leading a drive to bring some of the final assembly or the final critical parts back locally, where you have more control over what's happening and more control over the timing of that. Because I think for most projects, timing ends up becoming the primary driver for it. So I think there's definitely a drive at the moment to bring some assembly back to Australia.
Good. So, Kathleen, back to that big question again about the people. You know, we can't bring in people in the way that we did before.
Yeah.
A challenge, but also an opportunity. And
Yeah.
how do we help get our young people involved in these professions, and how do we help people transition from one industry to another?
Yeah, and I think also carrying on from the idea of what our buildings are and that they're actually going to develop to be far more. I'm always trying to get us to think about our built environment not in the narrow lens that we have now, but what could it potentially be in the future. So I see our buildings of the future all having building integrated photovoltaic panels all around the outside, but they'll look just like normal building panels, do you know? So, but they'll be generating electricity. So there's the whole intelligence behind that. So just before we started, I was talking to a member of the audience who's from NSW about the solar panel developments that are from that university that have gone all throughout the world. And so taking it further than that, we also need to be aware of sustainability, that we'll have perhaps roofs, or we'll have plantings of vegetation that we'll need to be eating and harvesting. Our basements, that if we're utilising old buildings that used to have car parks, will be, okay, maybe we'll have the fish farms that are doing the food generation above it. So we're actually bringing in skill bases that aren't traditionally in the architecture or the engineering, or the construction, but, you know, farmers, etc., to how do we use these. So I always say that I see an architect's role more as a GP. What we do is we combine all the skills and synthesise all the information together. But what we have to be aware of is that the buildings of the future are going to be more complicated, more complex, and they're going to involve so many other different technologies. So typically now on the most boring, simplest apartment building, we'd have at least 23, maybe 25 consultants. 10 years ago, that would have only been, you know, at most probably 10. But we've got so many specialised individuals and skill bases that we have to have in. So that will actually just develop more. And I think it will naturally happen because people are interested in far more different variety of careers.
Okay, good, thank you. Some very specific questions we have that have come in from the audience. Rather than deep dive into the long grass and a few of those, we do have a really good website that Engineers Australia has that answers some of the questions very specifically on building reform and Design and Building Practitioners Act. So perhaps point our audience to that question, because I want to keep us going in a direction here where I mentioned people and place. So we started off our conversation and we were really looking at about what will our children inherit. So maybe just to sort of bring our conversation to a close, and maybe a crescendo, if we've got that in there. And that crescendo would be some bold calls to action from each of you to challenge our audience and to say, well, what is our destination? And what will our children inherit? And what should they do about it? What can they be doing now? What can they be doing in 5 years' time? What can they be doing as a professional going forward? And as always, the person who's nodding most gets the question first.
Okay, so a couple of things for me is you all individually think of carbon zero and aim for 2030. Start with you in your own house. What can you do? Have a look at your use of energy, where you travel with your car. Can you do other methods? You know, ride your bike, whatever. Or everything. Just go through it all, and then take it home to your office. Get your whole office to do an analysis of your carbon. Once you actually go through that process, then have the conversation with all your clients coming in, because, you know, there is no reason why we can't, Australia as a bright country, drive carbon zero 2030 and try to make a better environment for the future. Second thing is our First Nations people. We can learn so much, and why don't we? Can you in your offices, and just put it out there into the ether, try to get Aboriginal students involved, encourage them to go through university to study engineering, to be involved on building sites, bring them into your office, listen to whatever information is available. I know the Government Architect actually has lots of papers that are out for us to be aware of. I find it really scary. I think I always do the wrong thing. But I think what I've actually learnt through projects is find out who the local Indigenous people are and talk to them. And that's the best thing you can do, just sit and listen and try to work out what material should be used, take in respect their environment and what's there.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Matt, come to you.
I think probably touches a little bit on what James said before, but being courageous. So I think as architects, as engineers, as designers, it's almost thinking that you do have a responsibility. So you do have a responsibility to the future. And all of us in our work get to impact the future in terms of the buildings we work on, the infrastructure we design, and yeah, in our everyday jobs. So I think that's probably the big challenge. I guess recognise the responsibility and act on it.
Thank you, Matt. Tony?
Yeah, I think taking Matt's point a bit further, I mean, we all, there's two things. We all have a responsibility to our clients to deliver the projects, but then taking beyond that, just looking over the horizon in terms of your responsibility to the community, to whatever asset, whatever building, whatever you're working on, to look at how that's going to perform in the future. So having always that pride, the sense of pride that you are producing something that's going to last, or certainly outlast you as an individual. And we all enjoy working and occupying spaces that have been built more than 100 years ago, which I think James mentioned before. And I think it's that sense of pride as a design community that we need to have, and I think we always have to have that in the back of our mind, sort of daily. That's probably the main call I'd have to our community.
Okay, thank you, Tony. James?
There's no doubt that we face some momentous global challenges, but I'm optimistic around the future for generations that will come after us, and that optimism is founded in the skills inherent in really good engineers and architects. I don't limit that to just engineers. Those two disciplines are the problem solvers, the creators, and generations that have come before us have faced and addressed some complex problems. I don't think we can waste any more time. I think 2030 should be our target for a particular challenge around global warming. So I'm optimistic for the role of engineers that will come into the professions that we occupy in the years ahead. I think Tony touched on it. I think what they do on a day-to-day basis might be different, but the really creative problem-solving element that is really elegant engineering or architecture, I think that's going to become more important than ever.
Okay, thank you, James. So that's about all that we have time for now. In closing, I'd like to paraphrase a former national president of Engineers Australia, and we used to have conversations around what do engineers do, and he used to say, and John McIntosh to me often, that engineers don't just dig tunnels or build buildings. What we do is that we create and connect and sustain communities. And Engineers Australia, we were founded out of the ashes, I suppose, of the First World War, a big challenge to us all, 1919. And our purpose is to advance the science and practice of engineering for the benefit of the community. So when we look at a simple piece of legislation like the Design and Building Practitioners Act, the intent of that is much more than just as what is in that act. So it might be about standards and codes, but it is about that science and practice of engineering for the benefit of the community. So the big, bold challenge to everyone in the profession and all the other professionals that we have to work for is not to just see that as a regulatory tick box, but is actually to, as all of these people around me have said tonight, really look at what we're doing, not just 15 years, 20, 30, but about how we really build back better, and we use construction and infrastructure as a real way to develop our society, community and economy post-COVID. Hopefully that's coming soon. So that, as I said, that's all we really have got time for. Some of the specific questions that came into us, that's on our website. We'll put a bit at the end of this that can direct you to it. But I would really like to thank all of our panellists. James, Kathleen, Matt, Tony, you've been great. I'm sure we could go on this conversation forever. I know I could. But thank you very much for your insight and thoughts, and hopefully we've all picked up a little more challenges of our own this evening. Engineers Australia would also really like to thank Brickworks Building Products. It's great to work with you. I've enjoyed it over many years, and we would appreciate your feedback on this session today. We want to do things better, as always, so give us your feedback, good, bad or indifferent. And on that note, thank you for your time, and stay safe, stay healthy and stay happy.
Thank you.
Thank you.